In many ways, sociology is the study of order and disorder in society. And we can look at what seems to reinforce order and what may serve to lead to disorder as well. Inequality is an important part of this discussion. And we can explore inequality in a variety of ways. We can explore class inequality, meaning like economic inequality, political inequality, educational inequality. We can look at how race and gender and sexuality and even age lead to inequality or reinforce dimensions of inequality in society. And in this brief video lecture, we're going to explore class inequality just a little bit. One way that we can look at inequality is by exploring income. And we can take this pretty complex looking chart here and see that a very, very small percentage of the US population has a pretty significant advantage in terms of the average family income that they receive. About 0.01% of the US population on average collects $27 million in income annually. But when we look at the big blue section of this chart, we see that the bottom 90%, or the lowest income earning 90% of the population, on average brings home about $31,000 a year. We can look at this in a different way through maybe a chart that doesn't seem as kind of daunting as that one. We can look at the annual income, and now this is just individual rather than family. The annual income of the top 0.1% is about $1.4 million. And the top 1% earns about $344,000. If we look at the share of all incomes received by each 20% of families, so if we break families down into 5 quintiles in the United States, we can see that the richest 20% of families bring in about 47.8% of all income earned. That's nearly half of all the income that's earned goes to 20% of the families. And we see that the poorest 20% of families bring home about 3.8% of the income in the United States. And this is in 2010. We can see how there's actually growing inequality between these groups and these families over time. So from 1980 to 2010, we've actually seen the gap between the richest portion of the population and the lowest earning portion of the population. This has been a trend that's been going on now for 30 years, with those who make more continuing to make more and actually making more today than they did in the 1980s. We can look at this across time even further back than 1980 and actually see that while in the 1940s to the 1980s we saw a dip in terms of inequality, actually we've been watching growing inequality over the last 30 years as well in terms of how much people are making. And going beyond just income, there are many people that hold a whole lot of wealth, meaning assets. This could be liquid or non-liquid assets that contribute to their access to opportunities in society. And they might not even have an income. They just hold a lot of wealth. And if we look at how wealth breaks down in the United States, we find that the highest wealth holding quintile, meaning the highest wealth holding 20% of the US population, holds roughly 84% of the wealth. And if we look here at the two lowest, this is the lowest wealth holding 40% of the US population, holds between 0.2 and 0.1% of all the wealth. So nearly half of our population holds basically no wealth. So what could lead to such a vast difference in terms of income and wealth holdings in the United States? Well, one thing that we should explore is the logic behind our economic system. And this logic is capitalism. The U.S. economy is rooted in the logic of capitalism. It's not pure capitalism, but it embraces the logic and many of the principles, and we can see how this system focuses on stressing private ownership. Stressing private ownership of the means of production, owning the land, owning the machines, owning the factories, as well as using the land and the machines and this means of production to then create many goods that can be marketed widely and distributed widely. And as they become distributed widely, ideally, those who are distributing these goods that are being produced through these means of production, there is a growth of profit and wealth that can then be reinvested back into the system, to reinvest back into the private ownership of means of production and an even more vast distribution of goods to then lead to more wealth. So we can look at it another way, in a very simple way, in thinking about the logic of capitalism as just part of mercantilistic exchange. Somebody takes money and they buy capital goods or commodities, be it wood or minerals or metals, and they use these to and transform them in the production process. So the wood and the metals in the production process get transformed by laborers in the means of production, so in the factories on the land, to become consumer commodities, be it like desks. And these desks then get sold to people, and they're not sold necessarily for the cost of the original capital good or commodity, or even the cost of the labor and the means of production. They get sold for more. And this is what's called a profit. And then these profits can then be reinvested back to the beginning of the process as money to then buy more commodities, invest in a bigger production process to get more consumer goods to gain more profits. So part of this logic is about trying to find efficiency in the process, to be able to find the cheapest capital good or consumer commodity, to find the cheapest kind of production process possible, to then produce the most amount of commodities. And part of the lowering those costs might be going to places where there's limited regulation on the commodities, be it how the wood is the trees are being cut down, what kind of protections exist around waterways, what kinds of labor protections might exist. And so in the goal of seeking profit, sometimes as efficiency is demanded, protections may get lost. In the United States, since the early 1980s, during this time period of growing inequality, it's sometimes characterized as the new economy. And what we've witnessed over the last 30 years and 40 years, really, is a gradual deindustrialization of the U.S. economy, so that industry that had previously been growing widely over the last 80 years in the U.S. has been moving to places where there is greater possibility for profit, so that efficiency can be more found in that process of profit accumulation. So we've seen the U.S. deindustrialize a bit and deregulate. So specific policies have been implemented to make it more possible for corporations and companies to face less restrictions if they move overseas, be it to Mexico, the Philippines, to China, so that when goods re-enter the United States, they may face lower tariffs or lower taxes. And so what we've witnessed is a change in the labor economy in the United States that's less of an industrial economy, which had become a pretty strong contributor to what we might call family wages, where unions had grown groups that were protecting workers and workers that were demanding wages so that they could support a family, close to living wages. But as these jobs have moved overseas to places where there's less likelihood for there to be worker protections. The new jobs that have emerged have largely been in the service sector that are more likely to be part-time, that are more likely to be closer to minimum wage, less likely to be family-type wages or living wages. This is really the condition of the new economy that we're living within, which is feeding into that the growth of modern inequality that we saw demonstrated in one of the earlier charts. So what keeps people participating in this? Why, if we can look at a chart and see that inequality keeps growing, if we see that wealth distribution is so unequal and income distribution is so unequal, what could keep people compelled to participate? Well, one reason why, some argue, is that capitalism is pervasive in our culture and our society, that we live in a culture of capitalism, that our culture is guided by the capitalist economy with very consistent values, beliefs, norms, and symbols. So we walk around with our consumer hat on. We want cheap goods. We walk around as laborers and we would like high wages. In some ways, though, we're also capitalists. If we have bank accounts where we're earning interest, or if we have retirements where we're gaining through our investments, we would like to see the principles of capitalism work as our capitalist self. While at the same time, our laborer self wants more wages, and at the same time, our consumer sense of self would like cheaper goods and easier access to more goods. But as we negotiate this, we find that capitalism seems to win because we've been trained so well to believe that time is money. And that's part of our norm. Becomes part of our belief system. And so we move forward with this belief. And so when we're faced with inequality, we don't even notice it. If we look at this chart, the actual distribution of wealth in the United States, the top bar, is dramatic. It's much like what I showed you in the earlier chart. But what Americans think the distribution is, that middle bar, is far less than it actually is. And when asked what they would like it to be, they claim that they would like to see even less. But it's interesting, if we don't even know the actual distribution of wealth, it seems like it might be a challenge to actually get there. And really, the fact that our perceptions are so skewed demonstrates the power and pervasiveness of the culture of capitalism. And so when exploring inequality in the United States, sociologists have come up with many ways to explore it. And we can find that there are maybe functions to inequality which may reinforce its existence. Davis and Moore in 1945 suggested that inequality is useful and functional, actually. That it provides motivation, it provides incentive, and it promotes innovation and actual hard work. That it keeps people working hard. Another way of thinking about it that might lead to and reinforce inequality that feeds into the system, like Herbert Gans said in 1994, another functionalist sociologist, argued that there are many social benefits to society from poverty, that the dirty work gets done, that there's wage laborers that are ready to take jobs. In some ways it might, having poverty subsidizes the activities of the affluent. There's people there opening doors for the rich folk when they stop at the restaurant. It creates jobs for people who serve the poor. So we have food banks and people can work at those food banks. It creates a market for inferior goods where we just keep going and buying the same damn cheap products. It ensures there are going to be enough people to populate the military. If it's an all-volunteer military, what we find is you're far more likely to volunteer if you have less economic resources. And in some ways, poor becomes a symbol of the underdog. It becomes something that maybe you don't want to be, and the rich becomes a symbol of what you would like to be. So there are functions to inequality that reinforce inequality in many ways and may lead to order. But some argue that inequality built into our structures actually creates conflict and creates problems. That structural inequality benefits the upper classes. And what this does is that it pits social groups against one another. That the rich and the poor have similar interests, maybe of gaining more, but then they have to go against one another because they're reliant on each other to gain what they would like. And this pits us against one another. And what we find is that meritocracy and this notion that the smartest and the best and the brightest and the most hardworking will get the most in life is actually a myth, according to critics of structural inequality, suggesting that perhaps those social groups with the most, or the upper class, hire those that they know, that really they overlook the inadequacies of people of their same social group oftentimes. And again, this pits us against one another. And as the upper class control dimensions of our culture, that culture of capitalism that we arise in, we hardly notice this. And we don't even notice the inequality that we live within, which is, apparent given the perceptions that we just witnessed in the other graph. So you can sit here and sew as all day long and may not be able to climb up that ladder, even though there are stories that tell us about people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. There are cases, but it's not the trend. And that's what sociologists are interested in, is seeing that trend and then seeing what may affect that trend. When we want to know what's leading to disorder, we could say, hey, perhaps the logic of capitalism and the structural inequality that arises from it is pitting groups against one another. And it pits them against one another in terms of class, race, gender. And in many ways, we see these systems intersect and reinforce one another. So when we're going out from a conflict perspective and exploring poverty, rather than maybe doing it from an individualistic perspective and saying that those who have lower incomes, those who have the least amount of wealth, perhaps it's not just because of a lack of hard work. Perhaps it's connected to a larger system, a system of capitalism. But we might not notice the effects of capitalism because the logic of it is so ingrained into our culture that it just has become naturalized to us, and we don't even see it as a social force that surrounds us and may lead to many people being deprived.